So we've talked about seeing beauty in place. And we've talked about finding sacred spaces and our contemporary lives. All of that comes together in this final module when we talk about embodiment and sanctuaries. Both embodiment and sanctuaries are ways of thinking about religion in place. Embodiment refers to ideas being brought to life, or on the academic side, the idea of thinking about what kinds of theories we need in order to analyze our real lives. And so what does this mean? That sounds kind of crazy. But I'll give an example. In the past, there was a scientific, put that in quotes, theory that women could not go to college because if we went to college, it would make our uteruses twist and then we couldn't give birth. And so the idea was if we didn't go to college, then the next generation would be able to live. Okay, we know that's not true, that theory has been disproved. Part of what disproves it is not just science, but the embodiment, what happens to our bodies. So, theory, let's talk about that a little bit. From a scientific side, means we develop a premise and then we test it over and over and over again, and then we understand it as a theory, and then that theory is retested again and again in order to find out, to verify if it is true. In the humanities, however, theory is more about how we think about social structures, how we think about who we are in our world, in our region, in our country, whatever it may be. That's why we have something like postmodernism, because we need a frame of analysis to talk about what's going on in our world and how that works. So that is an extremely different view from a scientific one. I wanted to point that out because when we talk about embodiment, we are talking about a theory. Embodiment reminds us that just because something is in the real world doesn't mean that it does not need analysis. How we talk about systems, how we talk about our world. An example, we looked at the video of the cathedral. People in medieval times did not need this idea of embodiment. That made no sense to them. They were where they were when they were. That was it. Since then, we've seen this change over time, and now we know that we do need a frame to be able to talk about and to analyze our world. Embodiment is an important one. Social theories are not just about science, but they are about where people come from. So this discussion relates to our study of religion and art. Embodiment is part of what art is about. Embodiment is how ideas are moved onto paper or onto plaster or into earthworks. However it may be, artists embody ideas, and that connects with religion as well. Let me give you another example. In the 16th century and into the 17th, there was a famous Spanish artist by the name of El Greco. What El Greco did was to have patrons who would hire him to do different portraits of family and nobility. There were also church patrons who hired him to do a series of, maybe the crucifixion or some other religious art. One of the series of paintings that he did was about the apostles. Peter, Paul, Andrew, Bartholomew, Simon. He had a whole list of them. And he did these paintings, and you look at them today, you can Google them and find them. And you look at them today and say, this apostle looks kind of, emaciated and depressed. Well, in fact, El Greco, because he lived in the time in which he lived, 1600s, he was needing to find a way to get some models for his artwork. And so what he did was go to the local insane asylum, which in those days was a pretty depressing kind of a location. So, yes, we look at the apostles today, the paintings he did, and we think they look emaciated and depressed. People in the times in which he lived didn't think about those kinds of details, didn't do that kind of analysis, and instead thought about how holy these figures looked. Even the idea of how holiness is embodied changes over time. So we may think of a baby as being holy. We may think of a beautiful woman as being holy. We may think of many physical attributes anthropomorphizing beauty, but in fact, we seldom today think of the gnarled old man as representing beauty or representing holiness. Those images that we have today are unique to our time and to our understanding. So, I wanted to bring that up because there are more ways to envision holiness, and there is more analysis of embodiment needed. Think for a moment about the disabled. When we often think of the disabled, we are often not thinking of people who represent holiness. So I'm going to come back to that at the end because I have a video I want you to watch. But let me talk about one more thing that's in the text. The author of our book discusses phenomenology. That is one scholarly tool through which we can analyze meaning. So phenomena are all around us. We are bombarded with what we see and what we hear all the time. Phenomenology studies are usually under philosophy, but there is a particular form of phenomenology that relates to the study of religion, and it's called the phenomenology of religion. So we know that faith is made up of belief, trust, and action. What does it mean then when we begin to analyze the belief and the action? These are phenomena that can be observed. This was an important focus for scholars of religion, because remember we talked about that history whereby religion got kind of shunted off to the side and that philosophy took a step forward as being more important in our world. So what then happens when we talk about phenomenology of religion? So in the late 19th and early 20th century, this grew as a way to solidify the idea that religion is a solid, sincere science. It was understood as a scientific way to think about studying religions. And so that included finding ways to create language to explain things like how we believe in God, how we believe in a divinity. One of the words that came up from this phenomenology of religion is the idea of the mysterium tremendum, reminiscent of our discussion of mystery. The mystery, the great mystery. Another term that came up. How do we know that that which is part of our lives as religion has any value? Is it only optional? And so the scholars of religion who followed the path of phenomenology of religion talked about the idea of homo religiosa. So if there's homo sapien, the knowing being, then there's also the religious being. And pretty much the authors of this idea, the theorists behind this, were saying that being religious is part of the makeup of human beings. Okay. The other section of this unit is about sanctuaries. And we learn about sanctuaries because we make them. Sanctuaries are not just naves of churches, church buildings, but in fact sanctuaries are places where we go to rest and rejuvenate. For some people it might be going to the desert or to the mountains. I know someone, a husband and wife, they go to the mountains regularly and camp, and that becomes their way of resting. Other people go to beaches. For some people it is the bedroom to which they retire each night that becomes their sanctuary. We are, in this day and age, able to take places that we understand as engendering holiness within us. Some of you have already taken some photos that reference these kinds of sanctuary places. Art helps us to challenge our ideas of space and of bodies. Okay, so that art isn't just repeating what we think, but in fact is taking us to new places, sometimes where we don't want to go. So you can see a lot of those different artworks within the text. Often they are multimedia, so it's the human figure that has been imposed into, say, a drawing, or it is a way to think about how sanctuary happens. So I wanted to bring all these things up because both sanctuaries and embodiment help us to think about religion in place. After this lecture, I want you to watch a video. We're back to the idea of embodiment. A video on theologies of disability. Then there is a quiz. This quiz will be a short one. I want you to compare Rothko's chapel from the introduction with one that you will select. I'm only going to give you two options, but all of this will be written. I want you to think about, what do you say about sacred space? How are these related to contemporary realities, which we've discussed? What do these works say about us as a people living in the 21st century? And so again, you will find all this explained on the test itself on Blackboard. Then you are on to the final project. But first, watch the video of Theologies of Disability.